Good evening. Welcome to our 165th step in our walking tour through the Bible. I keep on thinking we ought to hurry along through the book of Psalms, but then I come to the next psalm and I think, oh, this one's too good to pass over. Quite a few I have passed over, but not this one. This one is Psalm 64, bracket 65. And it's one of those psalms which talks about nature. Now, I find this very interesting. When you think about the Romantic poets, Wordsworth and Coleridge and so on, particularly Wordsworth, he is the great poet of nature. One of the things that the Romantic Revolution brought about, and the Romantic Revolution started 1798, I believe, with the publication of the Lyrical Ballads, is it brought about the triumph of feeling in poetry. Poetry should be about feeling, not thought, and the love of nature. And Wordsworth is full of feeling and he's full of the love of nature. You don't find much love of nature in the Psalms, despite the fact that the psalmist is a great poet. I'm speaking now as if all the Psalms are written by the same person. They may well have been finally edited by the same person. They are remarkably homogeneous, I must say, even though they may have been composed over several centuries. Now, there's no love of nature in the Psalms. There's no I wandered lonely as a cloud and I saw a host of golden daffodils in the Psalms. There is talk of plants and there is talk of the weather. But listen to this psalm and you'll see how different it is. It's a beautiful psalm, by the way, even though it's not Wordsworthian, it's still absolutely wonderful. To you our praise is due in Zion, O God. To you we pay our vows, you who hear our prayer. To you all flesh will come with its hit burden of sin. Too heavy for us our offences, you wipe them away. Blessed is he whom you choose and call, dwell in your courts. We are filled with the blessings of your house, of your holy temple. You keep your pledge with wonders, O God our Saviour, the hope of all the earth and of far distant isles. You uphold the mountains with your strength, you are girded with power, you still the roaring of the seas, the roaring of their waves, and the tumult of the peoples. The ends of the earth stand in awe at the sight of your wonders, the lands of sunrise and sunset you fill with your joy. You care for the earth, give it water, you fill it with riches. Your river in heaven brings over to provide its grain, and thus you provide for the earth, you drench its furrows, you level it, soften it with showers, you bless its growth. You crown the year with your goodness, abundance flows in your steps. In the pastures of the wilderness it flows. The hills are girded with joy, the meadows covered with flocks, the valleys are decked with wheat. They shout for joy, yes, they sing. I think it's a beautiful song. Um, there are many reasons why I think it's such a beautiful song. I love this phrase, the valleys are decked with wheat. They shout for joy, yes, they sing. Now, on the surface, that does sound a bit Wordsworthian in that it's sort of giving agency to inanimate objects. It's giving agency to plants. Plants can't sing, but they seem to sing. They seem to be rejoicing in their fruitfulness. One of the things actually about this psalm, which is in some ways a nature psalm, is it's also an anti-nature psalm. First of all, it talks about the man being in the temple, Mount Zion being the place where one gives thanks, where one receives forgiveness from God. So once again, we have Mount Zion, the temple, being the place where the grace of God is given to human beings, and human beings come to fulfillment and flourishing. Interesting, they come to fulfillment and flourishing in a building where God lives and in a city, a holy city, but nevertheless a city. In other words, there's no hint whatsoever that God's grace is mediated to us through nature, through plants and animals. None whatsoever. That's actually quite hard for modern people to grasp. The idea that you don't receive salvation through communing with nature. Rather, you receive salvation through communing with God in his temple, through the liturgy of the temple, and you meet God in the heart of the city. In other words, you meet God in the human community. Interesting, eh? Then he says, you uphold the mountains with your strength. Well, in other words, you uphold the mountains means quite literally, you hold them in place with your strength. In other words, you stop the mountains falling on us. You prevent earthquakes. You are girded with power. You still the roaring of the seas. In other words, if there's a terrible, terrible storm, you quieten the storm. And that's what happens in the book of Jonah. That's also what happens on the Sea of Galilee when Jesus sails on the Sea of Galilee. God's power is a power that subdues the terrible, awesome power of nature, the awesome power of nature, which is a threat to human beings. And the tumult of the peoples who make a big noise and want to destroy us, you calm them down as well. In other words, God is greater than nature. Nature is subdued by God. Nature is under God's control. The ends of the earth stand in awe at the sight of your wonders. The lands of sunrise and sunset you fill with your joy. And then it says, you care for the earth, you give it water. Well, you care for the earth. Yes, that's what we hear in the book of Genesis in the first few chapters. You give it water. You cause the rain. Your river in heaven brims over. They assumed that there was some sort of water source in heaven, and every now and then this would overflow, and that would be the rain. They didn't understand where rain came from. And thus you provide for the earth, you drench its furrows, you level it, soften it with sours, you bless its growth. Now it's clear here that what it's talking about is that God blesses the growth, not of wild nature, not of forests, but of fields, of cultivated nature. In other words, human beings plant wheat, and God makes the wheat grow by sending the rain. Incidentally, where is this wheat planted? Well, it's in the valleys. Valleys are sloping. Aha, not these valleys. The valleys are decked with wheat. This means like that. There's certain level steps. In other words, the valleys have terraced fields. Those terraced fields are created by human beings. The human beings have made the terraces in the valleys, and therefore they plant their wheat on these terraces, and God rains on them. What we have here is not nature per se, but nature as transformed by human beings. In other words, nature is only made beautiful when human beings intervene and make it so. Nature per se is not necessarily beautiful, it can be quite threatening. And I think that is also the message of the book of Genesis. Gan Eden, we call it the Park of Eden, but in fact we don't call it the Park of Eden, we call it the Garden of Eden, but more accurately it should be called the Park of Eden, the enclosed space of Eden. Nature becomes lovely when we enclose it, when we subject it to human control and to human intervention. You crown the year with your goodness. Abundance flows in your steps. In the pastures of the wilderness it flows. It even flows out into the desert. The hills are girded with joy. The meadows covered with flocks. How did those flocks get there? Those flocks are put there by human beings, and those flocks are cared for by human beings. So once again, we have this idea of we have both pastoral farming and arable farming. This is not actually about nature in its wildness. This is about farming and how God blesses the farmer. They shout for joy. Yes, they sing. The valleys sing. I think there's probably behind that idea something that I remember from my childhood, the sound of the cicadas in the valleys, making that high-pitched singing noise, which is a joyful sound to hear, I must say. When you go out into the countryside, as I did as a little boy in Malta, it was extremely beautiful to see the terraced fields with the crops growing in them and hearing the cicadas singing, knowing that indeed, despite the fact that Malta was extremely dry and extremely windswept and with very poor soil, it was a richly abundant land when it came to fruit and vegetables. Unfortunately, sadly, a lot of that farming knowledge has been lost now. A lot of the terraced fields have been allowed to fall into ruin. So what this is about, this psalm, is about the human relationship with God and the human relationship with nature. We have a relationship with nature which is mutually beneficial. It's particularly beneficial for nature. Here, too, human beings are fed by their farming, and therefore that's beneficial. But it's not really a tree huggers um, charter. Okay, I wonder what you make of that. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll meet again and we'll speak again about the Psalms. All the very best. Bye.